Hey everyone, it's Blake, and today we're going to be talking a little bit about Immanuel Kant and Kantian ethics, and some of the common criticisms of Kantian ethics. Um, so this is the second in kind of the framework content um, series of videos. From here, let me know if there's any specific theories that you want me to cover. Kant seemed like an obvious starting place because it is not particularly intuitive. Um, but yeah, if there's anything else in particular you want me to cover in future content lectures, let me know. Um, so this is a gross oversimplification of Kantian ethics, basically boiling it down to the stuff that is most essential to understand for the purposes of debate. Why do I consider this to be a gross oversimplification? This is the Wikipedia list of Kant's major works. So this isn't even a complete list. So yeah, I'm not going to cover everything that is covered in all of these books, but I am going to, you know, hopefully summarize most of them in the next 20 to 30 minutes. So let's go ahead and jump into this simplified um, version of Kant. So I kind of am breaking this up. First, we're going to talk about the major concepts of Kantianism, and then we're going to talk a little bit about common criticisms of Kantianism. So to start, these are the major concepts that we'll work through for Kantian ethics. So we'll go ahead and get started with intrinsicality. And along the way, I put these key concepts on there. I think I have a summary slide at the end that has all of the key concepts that basically should be everything you need to survive a Kant debate on one slide. So intrinsic means belonging naturally or essential. So Kant fundamentally believes that morality should start with something that is intrinsic to everyone. There are two key reasons for this that come up a lot in debate. The first is bindingness. If everyone has the basis for the moral theory, no one can opt out. In other words, if morality is something that is intrinsic, it is essential. It cannot be, removed or separated from the person. So they are bound to follow it. There's also the internal motivation argument. Basically, people are more likely to pursue something if they know it applies to them. In other words, if we were to word that in the inverse way, if morality doesn't stem from something everyone has, people won't care about following it. So people are more motivated if it's an intrinsic basis for morality. Another key concept that kind of goes hand in hand with this intrinsicality argument is that Kant believes humans are intrinsically valuable. So there's something about humans that makes them inherent, gives them inherent value. And so that will become important when we get to the second formulation of the categorical imperative. But really, when it comes to intrinsicness, especially in the debate context, we're more focused on this first key concept, the idea that morality should stem from something intrinsic. So what then is the best, most intrinsic thing for us to base our morality on? Well, Kant would contend that practical reason is universally intrinsic to humanity. Here are some justifications for that. Everything else collapses. This is a regress argument. So you can ask why to anything, but if you ask why to reason, you can see that reason matters. So to put that in more simple terms, the phrase that you might hear in debate is to ask a reason for a reason concedes the authority of reason. And what that means is, think of it this way. If I say utilitarianism is the best theory, you could say, why? And I would say, because it maximizes pleasure and minimizes harm. Why? Because pleasure is inherently good and pain is inherently bad. Why? Right? So we continue to ask why. But if we do that with Kantian ethics, and we get to the point where I am saying, practical reason is really important to everyone, and you say why, well, asking why is asking for a reason. You're asking for a reason why reason is important, which is giving away the fact that a reason would be an important thing to you. So to ask a reason for a reason concedes the authority of reason. Work through that as many times as you need to for that to make sense, but that is a really common argument, so make sure that makes sense, and let me know if it doesn't, and I can try to explain it a different way. Another common justification for practical reason is action theory. So action theory is kind of it's almost like a paradox, right? So all actions are infinitely divisible. The only thing that unifies them is reason. So if I'm, reaching to pick up my phone, we can infinitely divide that into, me picking up my arm, reaching it out, grabbing the phone, and then we can further refine that to pulling individual muscles, and then we can get down to the cellular level, and then we can basically everything is infinitely divisible. The only thing that makes that action whole is the fact that I had a reason behind doing it. Otherwise, it's just a series of meaningless cellular activity that is infinitely regressive. Another key justification for practical reason is culpability. You can only hold someone accountable if they used reason to justify it. In other words, you can't blame someone for an accident. So reason is inherently viewed as a part of our culpability scheme, meaning that we use people's reasons as justification to understand whether what they did was right or wrong. So we inherently use practical reason as the basis of our moral judgments. This concept of practical reason underpins pretty much every aspect of Kantian ethics. This is also a point where a lot of people would contest Kant's theories, but we'll talk about this more when we get to the common criticisms of Kant. So next is the categorical imperative. So this is kind of the place where most Kantian frameworks are working towards, is these concepts that are central, that are called the categorical imperative, that are central to Kantian ethics. So the key concept here is that all moral theories should meet three conditions, and these conditions are also called maxims. In basic terms, those conditions are that all actions should be universalizable, all actions should treat people as ends in themselves and not only means to an end, and all actors should behave as though they are in a kingdom of ends. So those are the three conditions, or maxims, or formulations of the categorical imperative. All of those mean the same thing, at least in this context. There is a fourth formulation out there in some Kantian writings, but even Kant himself said that it was not an official maxim. It was more so just a side constraint, and so for the purposes of debate, that fourth formulation is generally left out. But if you're reading something and it says there's four parts of the categorical imperative, that is technically correct, but for the purposes of debate, we really focus on these three. So let's talk about each one. So categorical imperative maxim 1 is universality, which you can also think about as non-contradiction. So all action should be universalizable without causing a contradiction. So an example of a contradiction. So this is basically the test that we do to determine if an action is universalizable. So the maxim says that all actions need to be universalizable. How do we make that decision? Well, we imagine if everybody took that action, would any contradiction occur? So for instance, if actor A wants to kill actor B, we hypothetically universalize that action to determine whether or not it's universalizable. If everyone killed someone, that would mean someone would kill actor A, making actor A unable to carry out the murder of actor B. This is illogical and contradictory, so we conclude that murder is immoral. So because universalizing that action would lead to a contradiction, something illogical, we conclude that that action must not be moral because it's not universalizable. Autonomy is a really important concept in Kantian ethics, and it is a conclusion of the universality and non-contradiction formulation of the categorical imperative. So if we apply the contradiction test to limiting another's autonomy, or Kantian writers like to use the term will, so if we try to limit another's will or restrict their freedom, the universality test looks a little something like this. If actor A wants to take away actor B's freedom, we universalize that action. If everyone restricted someone's freedom, that would mean someone would restrict actor A, making actor A unable to restrict actor B, which is illogical and contradictory, so we conclude that restricting freedom is immoral. Basically, if I restrict your freedom, we universalize that. Somebody's going to restrict my freedom. I no longer have the ability to restrict your freedom because my freedom is restricted. Again, Kantian ethics is very kind of wordy, heady, not intuitive, but this is another really important concept that is worth taking the time to understand. So the key concept, the conclusion from this, is that under Kant, we must respect other people's freedom and autonomy. So this is a place where a lot of people will draw their criterion, is respecting others' freedom, or even just a more broad consistency with universality. The second formulation of the categorical imperative is that we treat people as ends in and of themselves, not only as a means to an end. So this kind of ties back to that idea that I talked about earlier, that humans are intrinsically valuable. So there's often kind of a misrepresentation of this formulation that's basically saying we can never use people as means, and that is not what Kant says. Kant says we cannot use them as only means. We need to recognize that they are ends in themselves. Obviously, there are times where we use other people to get something that we desire or something that is good, but in doing so, we should not reduce them to an object used for our benefit, but rather recognize them as an end in the process of using them as a means. So sometimes you will need to use somebody else in order to achieve a desired outcome, but you should not neglect their humanity in doing so. So if you need to buy food and you don't have money, you can ask people for money. That is respecting their humanity, and also, if somebody gives you money, you are using them to achieve what you want. However, stealing that money would not respect that individual as an end in and of themselves, even though you are still using them as a means. So using someone as a means is not the same as neglecting them as an end. So essentially, we can still use people as long as we recognize their humanity. The third formulation of the categorical imperative is that all actors should behave as though they are in a kingdom of ends. So a kingdom of ends is kind of like saying everybody has that status described by the second categorical imperative formulation. Everybody is an end in and of themselves and has their own legislative right to morality. So kind of think that this formulation is in line very much with ideal theory. Kant refers to the kingdom of ends as a merely possible kingdom of ends, meaning that it is a hypothetical ideal world that he's talking about. Kant does not contend that the real world is inherently a kingdom of ends, but rather there is a possible kingdom of ends, and we should act as though we live in that kingdom of ends. So we assume that other people act in line with the categorical imperative, and we assume that everyone has equal legislative power, and in doing so, we just act as if we are in a merely possible kingdom of ends, and that means that we're not really concerned with the real world inequalities or injustices that make the world not ideal. So this is very much in line with the justification of ideal theory, and the assumption that everybody has equal legislative power in the merely possible kingdom of ends is another key point of criticism that we'll talk about when we get there. So to summarize again, here are the three conditions of the categorical imperative. I've starred the first formulation because that is the most pertinent one to debate, really. That's really where most of the discussion happens in the debate world, but these other ones are still important to help color our understanding and improve the accuracy of our analysis when it comes to Kant. So Kant and the role of the state. So a key concept under Kantianism is that the state, or the government, right, is responsible for protecting people's rights or freedom. So remember, we said that we have to respect people's rights or freedoms because restricting freedom is non-universalizable. So it's inherently immoral to restrict people's freedom. So the role of the state is to punish those who commit rights violations. And this kind of plays into the concept of retributive justice. Punishment is intrinsically just in response to a violation. It's okay to punish someone if they commit a moral violation. That's retributive. So Kant believes in retributive justice. Kant also believes that justice is retrospective. Punishment can only occur after the violation, not based on a prediction. So if you think somebody is going to, I don't know, if you think somebody is going to murder someone, that is not enough for you to then punish them. They have to actually take steps towards that action in order for you to be able to punish them. And because of the nature of freedom being freedom being the non-restriction of freedom being an inherent right that everybody has, the state should not, under any circumstances, restrict freedoms or be coercive towards a citizen who has not committed a rights violation. Once you commit a rights violation, again, retributive justice, punishment is on the table. But if you are acting as if you are a legislator in a merely possible kingdom of ends, and you're acting according to the categorical imperative and respecting other people's rights and things like that, the state has no right to restrict your freedom or be coercive. This is not something that explicitly gets discussed in a lot of Kantian ethics, but some people have a little bit of an issue making the jump from Kantianism to government action when it comes to like the debate world. So I included this discussion just to help clarify that jump. So here are the key concepts summarized, with stars next to the ones that are most commonly brought up in debate. So I won't read these all to you again, but pause the slide and make sure that you can explain all of these arguments, especially the ones with the stars. And once you can do that, you can basically pat yourself on the back and say that you have a functional knowledge of Kantianism when it comes to the way it's articulated in debate. So now we're going to switch gears a little bit and talk about the common criticisms of Kant. I've listed some of them here. We're going to talk about each of these in detail. But again, this is not an exhaustive list. There's, many writings out there that are critical of Kant, and their arguments go well beyond the scope of these 4 things listed on this slide. But these are the most common ones that come up in debate, and so these are the ones that I felt were most essential for you to know. But absolutely, there are other arguments out there. And honestly, the debate essential arguments could have been a whole nother hour-long video. But with that disclaimer out of the way, let's dig into these 4 that I've highlighted here. So the first argument is that Kantian ethics are exclusionary. And there's a couple of ways that we go about making this argument. So the first is that the practical reason key concept is an ableist one. So what kind of reasoning is considered practical? What about people with non-normative reason? Are people who cannot quote-unquote reason practically inherently immoral? So if practical reason is the foundation of all ethics, people with cognitive functioning differences that result in them reasoning in a way that others would consider impractical, are they then considered incapable of morality under Kantian ethics? That's obviously ableist and objectionable, and a reason why Kantian ethics should not be used. On the universality key concept, many people argue that that is an inherently or justifies homophobic thought, because homosexuality is a non-universalizable action. Because if everybody engaged in homosexuality, there would be no reproduction, no future generations, and that would be illogical, because then people would cease to exist, so they could not engage in homosexuality in the first place. So it is circular, it's illogical, it doesn't make sense. So the universality component is often used to justify homophobia. And the last of these most important or most common exclusionary arguments is that Kant himself was a raging racist. I have included this quote here that I will not read because it is disgusting. And, Kant debaters will argue that reading his theories are not the same as endorsing him as a person, but just the same. People who read this argument would say that giving him a platform is, spreading his influence, and we should really just let this theory die off so that we stop giving attention to this bad man. So that is a debate that you can absolutely see happen in a round. So the another common argument against Kant is that ideal theory is bad. So remember that second formulation, or the third formulation of the categorical imperative about the merely possible kingdom of ends, is basically a justification for ideal theory. And we often see debaters argue that ideal theory ignores material conditions, which allows structural issues to persist and grow, things like racism, discrimination, oppression, homophobia, sexism, ableism, all that kind of stuff. And the fact that we ignore material conditions also means our actions won't have the intended effect. So even if our intentions are good, the outcomes are bad, right? So this kind of ties into a deontology, consequentialism kind of aspect. So if I'm winning that consequentialism is good, ideal theory is not a viable option, because ideal theory is focused on the intention behind our actions. And non-ideal theory is preferable because it allows us to enact specific change against structural issues, because we recognize that those structural issues exist. And it's also easier to guide action because we're able to use actual real-world justifications for our actions instead of kind of looking to these broad, abstract moral concepts to try to justify our actions. Speaking of which, another common argument is that Kant can't guide action. There's kind of three different flavors of this argument. The first is perspective taking. We can never truly understand the perspectives of others, which means that the universality test is always going to be inaccurate because we cannot assume what other people would do accurately, right? So even an action like murder, right, when we try to universalize that, everybody's going to enact that in a different way, or everybody's going to perceive that in a different way. People have different thresholds for contradictions. People have different thresholds for what is logical and what is illogical. So in applying that universality test, different people would reach different conclusions. And we can never understand the perspective of others, so we're never able to make those assessments 100% accurately. Another argument is that it freezes action. So if anytime an actor, especially a government actor, has to make a decision, they have to reason through the whole categorical imperative. They need to do the universality test. They need to consider if they're using people as merely means. They need to consider if they're acting under the constraints of a merely possible kingdom of ends. That kind of decision making delays actions, and the hypothetical nature of the imperative makes it impossible to come to a final decision, because there would be infinitely ongoing debates about whether or not we are upholding the categorical imperative, because it is hypothetical. It is not something that we can point to and say, here's a material example of how this is right or wrong. So it freezes action, especially for government entities. And the last reason why the other reason why Kant can't guide action is that it is a subjective moral theory. Each person has different thresholds for contradiction, so there's no guarantee that my moral is the same as your moral. So if everybody has a different concept of morality, because we all have different thresholds for contradiction, then that means that there's no universal moral truth, so we can't really prescribe action. We can't say that we should do the resolution, because it just depends on who you are, and whether or not it meets your threshold for a contradiction or not. And the last kind of somewhat common argument we'll talk about is that Kant triggers permissibility, which is basically the idea that any moral or any action is considered morally permissible or allowable under a certain theory. It has permissibility has a lot of debate implications. Again, it could be its own hour-long video. But the most foundational application of it when it comes to Kant is as follows. So Kant claims that a universal maxim is a moral one, but there's no rules about how general or specific those maxims have to be, which means that maxims can be infinitely refined with qualifiers and conditional statements that make them universalizable. So instead of just saying, I want to steal from somebody, and that's not universalizable, we could contend a maxim like, it is okay to steal from someone if they are wearing blue stripes on Tuesday while standing outside at 12:45 p.m. If I universalize this, and everybody did this, there's not really a contradiction, because we're all targeting a very specific target instead of each other, ultimately leading to a contradiction. So this means that Kant ultimately permits morally reprehensible things as long as they are infinitely refined with qualifiers and conditional statements. That's probably an independent reason why Kant is a bad ethical theory, because it permits morally reprehensible things. This can get implicated to a pre-fiat voting issue, or if you are a particularly tricky debater, could be used to trigger permissibility and argue that moral permissibility inherently negates or affirms, depending on which side you're on. But again, that's a whole nother can of worms that I won't get into here. And that's it. So that is your mile-high overview of Kantian ethics and criticisms of Kantian ethics and the Kant debate. So make sure that everything on this slide makes sense to you and that you could explain it in your own words. And if you can do that, you're pretty well suited to at least hold your ground in a Kant debate. Again, these lectures are not meant to be a substitute for actual reading and research on the subject. So if you want to learn more about Kant or become a better Kant debater, I strongly suggest doing a little bit of reading. Authors like Engstrom and Korsgaard are commonly referenced Kantian authors. But yeah, that's it for this video. Let me know if there's any other content like moral theory videos you want me to cover. I hope this was helpful, and feel free to leave a comment, reach out, ask questions if you still have any sticking points or points of confusion. Otherwise, I will see you soon.